The Ballad of Johnny Arcane by Jim Nail, read by Jim Nail. Chapter 2, Johnny Loses His Voice, Part 3. For a period of 2 full moons, Johnny Arcane wandered, alone and lost, trapped in a prison whose walls were his skin, and the only door was his mind. For a while he stayed on the roads, but he kept encountering people, women gardening or drawing water from wells, men hauling carts full of vegetables, bands of mummers practicing their dances in open fields. They tried to speak to him, but he only mumbled a few words and hurried on his way, anxious to be forgotten. He grew hungry. All the food Mother had packed him was gone in a day, and his canteen was empty. The first night he slept between the rows of a cornfield and gnawed on half-ripe kernels of corn. The second day he filled his canteen from a roadside well, but he found no food, and he slept, cold and famished, like an outlaw, in a barn loft, after the farmer and his wife had extinguished their lamps and the dogs were quiet. But oh, his thoughts. He thought of Mother, how she honored the 4 directions each morning, and what he had told her. "You don't know anything about the 4 directions, Mother. You only know the 4 walls of this house." All this only a few days ago, and yet now it seemed so far away. He could visualize the 4 directions as they appeared from the summit of Gravestone Hill, where Huxley, Vermilion, and Rugchomper were buried. He thought of his father, Caspar Arcane, who wrote, "To be honest, for the first few months my heart was broken until I realized the rightness of your approach." Had his father carried this heartbreak longer than he cared to admit? What other heartbreaks had he uncovered in his sojourning? A shudder of sadness passed through him. Oh, if only you could know of something happening far away, a peril or an opportunity. Oh, if you could only change things from a distance. "And this," said Mother, "is how I knew you were a sojourner." In the morning there were more people on the road, all moving in the same direction, pulling carts festooned with colorful banners, laden with carvings of improbable beings, tureens steaming with savory concoctions, stacks of pottery and garlands of flowers. Donkeys pulled some of the carts. Children, both boys and girls, skipped and cavorted in brightly colored dresses. Bands of mummers progressed in twirling motions, trailing bright ribbons. There must be some kind of fair in the next village. Johnny watched it all from behind a blind of furs. He could not join them, although the aromas made him tremble with hunger. If he could make himself invisible, he would slip in among them, snatch a few pastries, perhaps a handful of persimmons for his pockets. But he couldn't bear the thought of being seen or of speaking to anyone. A path led into the forest, a dense forest of firs standing shoulder to shoulder, limb to limb. Johnny took this path. Immediately he was engulfed in a shadow almost as dark as night. He was comforted by its arboring shelter, and he recalled the story the dressmaker told of the men who was afraid of the sky and could only go outside if there was a forest. Days and nights. The moon swelled to ripeness and shrank to a dried rind. His body grew weak, but his thoughts, in their increasing strangeness, propelled him on his way. Through the sky of his mind flew objects, cooking utensils, ladles, and multi-tined forks, butter churns, hinges, and hasps, nail sets, keyhole saws. He heard melodies and recognized their names: the onion skin, the baker's misfortune, many the days I count my fingers. The path ascended continuously, and the climb weighed heavily on his legs. Hunger and thirst were his two relentless pursuers. He ate tree fungus and salmon berries, but water was scarce. When the trail skirted a spring-moistened cliff, he sucked on the rocks like lozenges. At night, the darkness was impenetrable. He slept where he was, on the trail. Each night was a little colder than the night before. His stomach shrank to the size of a child's fist, and he stopped defecating entirely. Late one afternoon, after many uncounted days and nights, he glimpsed something flickering among the trees. A precipice rose from a small clearing, and behind it the rounded, dark mouth of a cave. Directly in front, a shrine had been built, its wooden platform thickly covered in bright green moss. 7 corn lamps burned on the altar, and in between the lamps, plates of food: oat cakes, baked apples, yellow melons, roasted parsnips and rutabagas, strips of dried cat meat. A glass pitcher sparkling with clear water, and next to it a tumbler waiting to be filled. An utterance rose from Johnny's chest like a river breaking through a logjam. He fell to his knees, lunged for the pitcher, filled the tumbler, and poured the water down his throat. Then he grabbed at the food, thrusting several oat cakes into his mouth at once. He downed another tumbler of water and fell back in the dirt, exhausted. The sensation of food and water coursing through his limbs was almost unbearable. He couldn't move, and he felt his consciousness spiraling like a whirlpool. He keeled onto his back and collapsed into a deep sleep. He opened his eyes. It wasn't completely dark. A yellow glow slipped in and out of the branches overhead. He sat up and saw the corn lamp still burning on the altar, casting a pale illumination on something he hadn't noticed before. So compelling had been his hunger. A carved image of a woman on the niche of the shrine, completely naked, her long black hair lifted aloft by the beaks of tiny red-winged blackbirds. Before her face, wisps of incense rose from cones nestled among the moss. In the lamplight, she looked like a real person. Her skin had a velvet sheen, and he thought he saw beads of perspiration on her breasts and shoulders. Her body swayed from side to side in the flickering light, but her dark eyes remained immobile, fixed on his. He held their glance as long as he could until the weariness overtook him. Flat on his back in the dirt, he slipped into a shallow slumber, waves of bliss and pleasure radiating through his limbs, his torso supported by many tiny, soft, and supple hands. A pale sun flooded his face. He woke, refreshed, but weak. He knelt at the altar, drank the rest of the water, and ate some of the food. He ate all the melons, a few more oatcakes, some of the cat meat. Then he gathered up all the rest and dropped it into his backpack. He stood. On the ground were 2 stone jars full of corn oil. He took them both in his hands. Who keeps these lamps lit? And who refills these plates with food? The food was not an issue. He needed it to survive. But with one of the jars, he refilled all the lamps. He took a few flints from the pile and placed them in his backpack with the other jar of oil. He took one last look at the altar. Refreshed with the oil, the lamps danced happily, and the carved woman smiled. Johnny stared at her face. He found it hard to believe she had seemed so real to him in the dark of night. Her paint was chipped, and her skin was rutted with the grain of the wood. Enough of these silly rituals, these foolish beliefs based on nothing but ignorance. He had to know what was really out there, beyond the boundaries of the 4 directions. It was the burden of the sojourner. There was no trail beyond this place, but he found some footholds in the cliff. His fingers were bruised, and his knees were shaky by the time he reached the open space at the top. There was a rocky summit with a view in all directions, everywhere. Trees, mostly firs, but some deciduous maples and alders, gilding the green with the streaks of early autumnal gold. Bands of different shades of color layered the receding distance, brush-stroked by mist and shadow, and on the far horizon, a single magnificent mountain cloaked in white. The path from there led ever downward and continually branched. He didn't stop to decide. He just plunged the direction his body fell. Gravity chose his course again and again. For a while the free fall exhilarated him, but soon his joints and muscles began to recoil with each impact. Branches slapped his face and thorns scratched his arms. He slowed a little. He stopped to rest. It was dark and cool, but he was drenched in perspiration. He ate some food and continued. The first night he slept uneasily. Owls whooped, bats whistled, and moths fluttered against his ears. Nights after that he sank like a stone, exhausted. In only a few days he ate all the food from the altar, and he had no water. He heard water everywhere, phantom rainfall in the high canopies, cascading streams in gulches far below. The sound of water haunted his dreams. He ceased to feel his legs. His body slammed into trees and tripped over vines. His foot snagged on a rotten stump, and he tumbled like a log down a ravine of gorse bushes, barbed leaves puncturing his skin. He saw something like smoke rush out of his mouth when he struck the hard ground, and above him a crow dropped a silvery object, and he watched it fall. Before him was a dark, brackish pool. He flung himself at it and drank deeply of its bitter offering. He felt his blood explode, and a burst of sparks peppered his vision, followed by a gulf of darkness. He awoke sick. His stomach knotted in pain, and his arms and legs thrashed like branches in a storm. He rolled onto his side and vomited out the entire contents of his body. In the vomit he saw creatures like cockroaches scurrying away in the underbrush. and armies of maggots waving at him from the bile. A spasm ripped through his bowels, and they unleashed a burden so putrid he rolled over and vomited again. He lay there feverish, puking and crapping, moaning in pain, and then contracting into stillness as solid as ice. Shadowy figures approached. Each one offered him something, but he did not know who they were or what they offered. Sometimes he was able to rise in the air above his body, but he didn't have the strength to fly. All at once, his vision congealed, and he was staring into the face of a creature, its eyes fixed on him intently. It was not a dream or a phantom, and at the same time he felt warmth rushing back into him from all directions. The creature was a weasel, and it held in its mouth the body of a large quail, its top knot a quivering banner in the wind. The weasel had been waiting for this moment. It dropped the bird into the dirt and nodded towards it several times. "This is for you." Then it disappeared. Johnny sat up suddenly. The sun was shining, and his body felt whole and solid. He regarded the gift, the quail, with curiosity. He desired it. With bare hands he plucked the feathers and pulled the body apart, dumping the intestines out on the ground. Memory rushed in. He got up on wobbly legs and groused about in the bracken for twigs and small pieces of wood. He opened the backpack and found the jar of corn oil and the flints. He drenched the damp wood with oil, struck the flints, and soon had a crackling fire. He skewered the bird, roasted it, and devoured it. Then he lay on his back and stared into the blue of sky for the rest of the morning, slipping between sensations of great joy and great sadness. Sun broke through the trees. With a lightened heart, he continued on his way. His tumble down the mountain had deposited him at the head of a well-worn trail, winding downhill through the forest at a gentle slope. Birds serenaded him from branches, and here and there the trees parted to allow beams of sunlight to warm his shoulders. In time, the trail joined a small brook of clear water. He drank from it freely. He came across a meadow lush with wild green mustard, and he stuffed a handful of its leaves into his mouth. It was a tonic to his nerves and sent a jolt of power into his limbs. At nightfall, he found a small cabin with no windows and no bedding, only a hard wooden platform, but he slept there like a baby. He began to discover other signs of human presence. Small stone cairns marked the place where the trail made a bend. There was a bare footprint in a mud puddle and a goat man's rag tied to a branch, the remnant of a fire. Further along, he came across stick figures and undecipherable runes scratched in a stone wall, and once a magnificent apple tree laden with yellow fruit standing next to a broken down windmill. He could feel the weight of his solitude lifting. People! The thought flooded him with apprehension and longing, mostly longing though. In this dark forest filled with creatures that sought his attention, this was the only thing that filled him with hope and momentum. A road then, and people on the road, their smiles, their voices, their laughter, the touch of a hand, the sparkle in an eye. The thought made his legs quicken and his heart thump with a nervous joy. But there was a problem.